Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story tells the impossible truth of an enslaved man who became the heir to a Gilded Age mansion and dared to challenge the richest dynasty in America. What happened defied the laws of his time, threatened an empire built on power and silence, and revealed a secret the system was never meant to confront. This is a heavy and intense account. Take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Stay until the end, because this story forces a question history still refuses to answer. Let's begin. In the fall of 1891, a black man walked through the gardens of one of the most expensive mansions in America. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than most workers earned in a year. His shoes were polished, his posture was perfect, and when the armed guards surrounded him with their weapons drawn, he did not run. He did not beg. He simply smiled and said 7 words that would change everything. "Tell Theodore that Bessie's son came home." The guards froze. The head of security, a man named Patrick O'Brien, who had worked for the Harrington family for 15 years, felt his blood turn cold. He had heard that name before. Bessie. It was a name that was never spoken inside the mansion. A name that belonged to a ghost. A name that the Harrington family had paid good money to erase from history. By the time O'Brien recovered enough to ask for the stranger's name, the man had vanished into the night. He left no trace, no footprints, no evidence that he had ever been there at all. But inside Rosecliff Manor, behind the marble walls and the golden chandeliers, panic had already begun to spread. Who was this man? Where did he come from? And what did he know about Bessie? This is the true story of Solomon Graves, a man born into slavery who died a millionaire. A man who spent 30 years planning the destruction of one of America's most powerful families. A man who proved that revenge, when served cold enough, can burn hotter than any fire. But to understand how Solomon Graves brought down the Harrington dynasty, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a cotton plantation in Georgia. Back to the year 1849. Back to the night when a baby was born in secret, and a chain of events was set in motion that would shake the foundations of the Gilded Age. The Magnolia Fields plantation covered 12,000 acres of prime Georgia farmland. It was owned by Augustus Harrington II, the heir to a railroad fortune that stretched from Savannah to New York. Augustus was 32 years old in 1849. He had a wife named Helena, who came from old Charleston money. He had a son named Edward, who was 5 years old. He had another son named Theodore, who was only 2. And he had 347 slaves who worked his cotton fields from sunrise to sunset. Among those slaves was a woman named Bessie. Bessie was 24 years old. She had been born on the plantation and had never set foot outside its borders. Her mother had been a field hand who died of fever when Bessie was 9. Her father was unknown, as was the case for most slaves. But Bessie was different from the other workers at Magnolia Fields. She was beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. Her skin was the color of honey. Her eyes were large and expressive. And she had been selected, at the age of 16, to work inside the big house as a domestic servant. Working inside the big house was considered a privilege. The work was lighter, the food was better. The beatings were less frequent. But it came with dangers that field hands never had to face. Dangers that Bessie understood all too well. Augustus Harrington first noticed Bessie when she was serving dinner to his guests on a hot summer evening in 1847. She was 22 years old. He was 30 years old and bored with his fragile wife, who seemed to be sick more often than she was healthy. The way Bessie moved through the dining room, graceful and silent, caught his attention. The way she kept her eyes down but still managed to see everything fascinated him. Within a week, he had arranged for her to be transferred to his personal study as a cleaner. Within a month, everyone in the slave quarters knew what was happening behind those closed doors. No one spoke about it, not out loud, not where anyone could hear, but they all knew. The other slaves saw how Bessie would return to the quarters late at night with her dress disheveled and her eyes empty. They saw how the master would send for her whenever his wife was visiting relatives, late at night with her dress disheveled and her eyes empty. They saw how the master would send for her whenever his wife was visiting relatives. They saw, and they understood, and they kept their mouths shut, because speaking would mean death. In the spring of 1849, Bessie realized she was pregnant. She tried to hide it for as long as she could. She wrapped her belly with cloth. She wore looser dresses. She avoided being seen by the mistress of the house at all costs. But by August, there was no hiding it anymore. Her belly was too big. The baby was too close to coming, and everyone on the plantation was waiting to see what would happen. Helena Harrington, Augustus's wife, was not a stupid woman. She knew about her husband's visits to the slave quarters. She knew about Bessie. And when she saw Bessie's swollen belly, she knew exactly whose child it was. But Helena was also a practical woman. She came from a world where men did what men did, and wives looked the other way. Causing a scandal would only hurt herself. So she did what women of her class did in those situations. She pretended not to see. She pretended not to know. And she waited for the problem to solve itself. The baby came on September 15th, 1849, in a small cabin at the edge of the slave quarters. An old slave woman named Martha, who had delivered more than 100 babies in her 60 years of life, helped Bessie through the birth. It was a difficult labor. Bessie screamed for hours. The other slaves stood outside the cabin, listening, praying, hoping that the mother and child would survive. Just before midnight, a baby boy took his first breath. Bessie held him in her arms and cried, not from sadness, not from joy, from something in between. She knew what her son's life would be. He would be a slave, like her. He would work the fields, like her mother. He would suffer, like everyone she had ever loved. But looking at his face, at his tiny fingers, at his eyes that were already showing a hint of grey, she made a decision. "Your name is Solomon," she whispered, "and one day you're going to be free." Old Martha, who was cleaning up after the birth, heard those words. She also noticed something else, something that made her pause. The baby's skin was lighter than Bessie's, much lighter. And those grey eyes were not the eyes of a slave. They were the eyes of Augustus Harrington. Martha had been on the plantation for 40 years. She had seen things, she had kept secrets, she knew how to survive. And she knew that this baby, this evidence of the master's sin, was in terrible danger. If Helena Harrington decided that the child was a threat to her own son's inheritance, she could have him sold or killed with a single word. So Martha did something that she had never done before. After Bessie fell asleep, exhausted from the birth, Martha took a small object from her pocket. It was a gold medallion that she had found in the master's study years ago, dropped and forgotten behind a bookshelf. The medallion had the initials A.H. engraved on it. Augustus Harrington. Martha had kept it hidden, not knowing why, just feeling that someday it might be important. That night, she buried the medallion under an old oak tree at the edge of the property. She marked the spot with 3 small stones. And she made her own decision. If this child ever needed proof of who his father was, the proof would be waiting. Solomon Graves grew up in the shadow of the big house. He lived with his mother in a small cabin that had 1 window, 1 door, and a dirt floor. He ate cornmeal mush for breakfast and beans for dinner. He wore clothes that were patched and repatched until there was more patch than original fabric. And from the age of 5, he worked. His first job was carrying water to the field hands. He would wake before dawn, filled 2 wooden buckets from the well, and walked back and forth across the cotton fields until his arms felt like they were going to fall off. If he spilled water, he was beaten. If he was too slow, he was beaten. If he looked at a white person without lowering his eyes, he was beaten. This was his life. This was the only life he knew. But Bessie refused to let Solomon's spirit die. Every night, after the work was done and the overseers had gone to sleep, she would sit with him in their cabin and teach him things that slaves were forbidden to learn. She taught him to read, using a Bible that she had stolen from the big house, 1 page at a time. She taught him numbers using pebbles and sticks. She taught him about the world beyond the plantation, a world that she had never seen but had heard about from other slaves who had been sold and bought and moved from place to place. "There's a whole country out there," she would tell him. "Cities bigger than anything you can imagine, places where black people are free, where they own businesses and wear fine clothes and nobody can tell them what to do." Solomon would listen with wide eyes. "Can we go there, Mama?" Bessie would stroke his hair and smile sadly. "Someday, baby. Someday." But she knew the truth. There was no escape from Magnolia Fields. The plantation was surrounded by miles of wilderness. Runaway slaves were hunted with dogs and guns. Those who were caught were whipped until their backs were nothing but raw meat, and then they were put back to work as a warning to the others. Bessie had seen it happen. She had heard the screams. She knew that trying to run was almost certain death, so she did the only thing she could do. She gave her son knowledge. She gave him hope. And she gave him a secret. When Solomon was 7 years old, Bessie told him the truth about his father. They were sitting by the creek that ran along the edge of the plantation. It was Sunday afternoon, the only time when slaves were allowed a few hours of rest. Solomon was throwing stones into the water, watching them skip across the surface. Bessie was watching him, building up the courage to say what she had been wanting to say for years. "Solomon, baby, there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were so much like his father's. "What is it, Mama?" She took a deep breath. "You know how the other children have fathers who live in the quarters with them, how they know who their daddies are." Solomon nodded. He had noticed that. He had wondered about it. But he had learned, like all slave children learned, that some questions were not safe to ask. "Your daddy doesn't live in the quarters, Solomon. Your daddy lives in the big house." The boy was confused. The big house? But only white people live in the big house. Bessie took his small hands in hers. "That's right, baby. Your daddy is a white man. Your daddy is Master Harrington." Solomon was too young to fully understand what that meant. But he understood enough. He understood why his skin was lighter than the other children's. He understood why the master sometimes looked at him with an expression that was half guilt and half something else. He understood why the mistress of the house would stare at him with cold hatred whenever he came near. He was different. He had always known he was different. Now he knew why. "Does he know?" Solomon asked. "Does he know I'm his son?" Bessie nodded. "He knows, baby. He knows." "Then why doesn't he help us? Why doesn't he set us free?" Bessie pulled her son close and held him tight. "Because that's not how this world works, Solomon. That's not how it works for people like us. But someday, baby, things are going to change. And when they do, I need you to remember who you are. You're not just a slave. You're not just property. You're the son of Augustus Harrington. And one day, they're going to know it." Solomon never forgot those words. They burned themselves into his memory like a brand. And years later, when everything had been taken from him, those words would be the fuel that kept him going. The overseer at Magnolia Fields was a man named Silas Crenshaw. He was 45 years old, 6 feet tall, and had hands like slabs of meat. He had been working as an overseer for 20 years, first in Mississippi, then in Alabama, and finally in Georgia. He was known throughout the region as a man who could break any slave, no matter how stubborn. Plantation owners paid premium wages for his services. Silas took an immediate dislike to Solomon. It was not personal, at least not at first. Silas disliked all slaves. He considered them animals, less than animals, tools that could talk, but had no more value than a plow or a mule. But Solomon was different. Solomon looked him in the eye when other slaves looked at the ground. Solomon asked questions when other slaves kept silent. Solomon had something in him that Silas recognized from his years of breaking men. Solomon had pride, and Silas Crenshaw was very, very good at destroying pride. The beatings started when Solomon was 10 years old. Silas would find reasons, invent reasons, create reasons to punish the boy. Solomon brought water too slowly. Solomon looked at a white visitor wrong. Solomon was humming while he worked, which was disrespectful to the master's peace. Every offense, real or imagined, was met with the whip. The scars accumulated on Solomon's back like a map of suffering. By the time he was 12, his skin was a patchwork of raised welts and smooth burns. Each one had a story. Each one was a lesson in what it meant to be property. But Silas never managed to break Solomon's spirit. No matter how many times he beat the boy, no matter how much pain he inflicted, there was always something in Solomon's eyes that remained undefeated. A spark, a flame, something that refused to die. "That boy ain't right," Silas would tell the other white workers. "Got something wrong in his head. Look at the way he looks at you, like he's thinking things, like he's planning things." The other workers would nod and agree, because agreeing with Silas was the safe thing to do. But they all noticed the same thing. Solomon was not like the other slaves, and that made him dangerous. What none of them knew was that Silas had his own suspicions about Solomon's parentage. He had seen the boy's gray eyes. He had noticed the light skin. He had heard the whispers in the quarters about Bessie and the master, and he had put the pieces together. If Solomon was indeed Augustus Harrington's son, that made him a threat. Not to Silas personally, but to the natural order of things. The idea that a slave could carry the blood of his master, could be half-white, could potentially claim some kind of connection to the Harrington family, was an abomination. It went against everything that Silas believed about the separation of the races. So he beat Solomon harder than he beat the others. He gave him the worst jobs. He made his life a living hell. Because in Silas's mind, he was doing God's work. He was putting a mongrel in his place. He was maintaining the proper order of the world. And Solomon, for his part, absorbed every beating and stored it away in his memory. He remembered every blow, every insult, every drop of blood. He did not cry out. He did not beg for mercy. He simply endured and remembered and waited, because his mother had taught him that things would change someday. And when that day came, Solomon intended to be ready. The year 1861 changed everything. The Civil War began in April of that year, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Within weeks, the entire country was at war. The southern states, including Georgia, seceded from the Union. Young men marched off to fight, and on plantations across the South, slaves began to whisper about something they had never dared to hope for: freedom. Solomon was 12 years old when the war started. He did not fully understand what was happening, but he understood enough. He understood that people were fighting over whether or not slavery should exist. He understood that the northern armies wanted to free the slaves, and he understood that if the North won, his life would never be the same. The war years were hard at Magnolia Fields. Most of the young white men had gone to fight, leaving the plantation short-staffed. Food became scarce as the Confederate Army requisitioned supplies. The slaves were worked harder than ever to make up for the missing workers. And Silas Crenshaw, who was too old to fight, became even more brutal as his frustration grew. But there was something else in the air, something that the slaves could feel but could not name. Hope, the possibility that the world they knew was coming to an end. That someday, maybe soon, they would wake up and be free. Augustus Harrington watched the war with growing dread. He was 50 years old now, and his health was failing. His railroad empire, which had once stretched across the South, was being destroyed by Union forces. Every week brought news of another bridge blown up, another depot burned, another line cut. His fortune, which had seemed so secure, was slipping through his fingers like sand. And in the quiet hours of the night, Augustus thought about Bessie, about Solomon, about the son he had never acknowledged, about the weight of his sins. Helena Harrington had died in 1858, finally succumbing to the illness that had plagued her for years. Augustus had not remarried. His legitimate sons, Edward and Theodore, were both serving in the Confederate Army. Edward was a captain. Theodore was a lieutenant. They were fighting to preserve a way of life that their father had built, fighting to keep people like Solomon in chains. One evening in the spring of 1862, Augustus did something that no one expected. He called his lawyer to the plantation and dictated a new will. The lawyer, a nervous man named Samuel Whitfield, listened with growing alarm as Augustus spoke. The will contained the usual provisions. The plantation would go to Edward, the eldest son. The railroad interests would go to Theodore. Various sums would be distributed to distant relatives and charitable organizations. But then Augustus added a clause that made Whitfield's pen freeze in mid-air. I wish to acknowledge my natural son, Solomon, born to the slave woman Bessie in 1849. Upon my death, Solomon is to be freed from bondage and granted the sum of $50,000 to be held in trust until he reaches the age of 40. Whitfield looked up from his paper. Sir, I must advise you, this clause is highly irregular. It could be contested. It could cause scandal. Augustus waved his hand dismissively. I don't care about scandal. I'm dying, Whitfield. I can feel it in my bones. And I'll be damned if I face my maker without trying to make things right. But sir, the other provisions. Your legitimate sons. My legitimate sons will inherit everything else. This is a pittance compared to what they're getting. But it's something. It's an acknowledgement that the boy exists, that he matters, that he's my blood. Whitfield had no choice but to comply. He wrote down Augustus's words, had the document signed and witnessed, and locked it away in his office safe. He hoped, for everyone's sake, that the will would never see the light of day, that Augustus would recover and change his mind, that the war would end and things would go back to normal. But things were never going to be normal again. The night of March 12, 1863, started like any other night at Magnolia Fields. The slaves finished their work at sundown, ate their meager dinners, and went to sleep in their cabins. The moon was full, casting silver light across the cotton fields. The air was warm for March, with a hint of the summer heat to come. Solomon was 14 years old. He had grown tall for his age, with broad shoulders and strong arms from years of hard labor. He slept in the same cabin as his mother, on a straw mattress that was more whole than mattress. The sound of crickets drifted through the window, the smell of wood smoke hung in the air. He was dreaming when the screams started. Solomon's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he was confused, not sure if the screams were part of his dream or something real. Then he smelled the smoke, and he knew. Fire. He jumped off his mattress and looked around the cabin. His mother's bed was empty. The door was open, and outside he could see orange light flickering against the darkness. Their cabin was on fire. Solomon ran outside, coughing from the smoke that was already filling his lungs. The entire front wall of the cabin was engulfed in flames. The fire was spreading fast, climbing up the dry wooden walls like a living thing. And somewhere in that inferno, his mother was screaming, "Mama!" Solomon ran toward the cabin, but the heat drove him back. The flames were too intense. He could not see anything through the wall of fire. "Mama!" He tried again, shielding his face with his arms, forcing himself closer to the burning structure. His skin blistered from the heat, his eyes watered from the smoke. But he kept going, kept pushing, because his mother was in there and he had to save her. Then he saw her. Bessie was crawling through the doorway, her clothes on fire, her skin blackened and peeling. She had managed to drag herself almost to the threshold before the flames had overwhelmed her. Her eyes found Solomon through the smoke. Her mouth moved, forming words that he could barely hear over the roar of the fire. The medallion. Martha. The oak tree. Solomon reached through the flames and grabbed his mother's hand. He pulled with all his strength, dragging her out of the burning cabin. Her dress fell away in charred pieces. Her hair was gone. Her face was barely recognizable. But she was alive. Barely. "Mama, hold on. Please hold on." Bessie's eyes were fading. Her breath was coming in short, painful gasps. But she had one more thing to say, one more secret to share. "Avenge our blood." And then she was gone. Solomon held his mother's body in the dirt outside the burning cabin. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply sat there, holding her, while the fire consumed everything they had owned. The other slaves gathered around, watching, not knowing what to say or do. This kind of thing happened. Fires broke out. People died. It was the nature of life on a plantation. But Solomon knew something that the others did not. He had seen something in the moments before the fire started. A figure standing in the shadows near their cabin. A white man watching, not trying to help, not raising the alarm, just watching. And when the fire started, the figure had walked away. Solomon did not know who the man was. The smoke and the darkness had hidden his features. But he knew one thing for certain. The fire was not an accident. Someone had murdered his mother. And whoever it was, Solomon was going to find them. The days after Bessie's death passed in a blur of grief and rage. Solomon buried his mother in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation, in an unmarked grave that looked just like all the others. He did not have money for a headstone. He did not have permission to hold a proper funeral. He simply dug a hole, lowered her body into the earth and covered it with dirt. The other slaves left him alone. They understood grief. They had all experienced it multiple times in their lives. Losing parents, children, spouses, friends, all taken by death or by sale, or by the casual cruelty of their masters. Grief was as common as hunger on a plantation. But Solomon's grief was different. It was cold, hard, focused. He spent hours thinking about the figure he had seen that night, trying to remember details, trying to piece together clues. The man had been tall. He had been wearing dark clothes, and there was something about the way he stood, the way he moved, that seemed familiar. Then, 3 days after the fire, Solomon remembered something. Old Martha. His mother's last words had mentioned Martha. The oak tree. The medallion. Solomon did not know what any of it meant, but he knew that Martha might have answers. He found her in the evening, after work, sitting outside her cabin and smoking a pipe. Martha was over 60 now, ancient by slave standards. Her hair was completely white. Her face was a network of wrinkles. But her eyes were still sharp, still watching, still seeing everything. "Miss Martha," Solomon said, approaching her carefully, "can I talk to you?" Martha looked at him for a long moment. She had been expecting this visit. She had been expecting it for 14 years. "Sit down, child." Solomon sat. "Your mama told you about the oak tree, didn't she?" He nodded. Martha took a long drag from her pipe. "I've been keeping something for you, Solomon. Keeping it since the night you was born. I always knew this day would come. I just hoped it wouldn't come so soon." She told him about the medallion, about the initials, about how she had buried it under the oak tree at the edge of the property, marked by 3 stones. She told him about Augustus Harrington, about the affair, about everything she had seen and heard over the years. But there was something else, something even more important. Inside that medallion, child, there's a key. A tiny little key hidden in the back. I don't know what it opens, never did figure it out, but your mama knew. She told me once that it was the key to everything, the key to bringing the Harringtons down. Solomon's heart was pounding. What does it open? Martha shook her head. I don't know. Your mama never told me, but she said that when the time was right, you would know. You would figure it out. How am I supposed to figure it out? I'm just a slave. I can't even leave this plantation. Martha reached out and took Solomon's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You ain't just a slave, Solomon. You're Augustus Harrington's son. You got his blood in your veins, and one day that blood is going to mean something. One day you're going to use it to destroy everything he built. She paused, her eyes boring into his. But not yet. You're too young, too weak. If you try to fight them now, they'll kill you just like they killed your mama. You need to wait. You need to grow strong. You need to learn everything you can about them and their world. And then, when you're ready, you need to make them pay. Solomon listened to every word. He absorbed it all. And in that moment, sitting outside Martha's cabin as the sun set over Magnolia Fields, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would wait. He would grow strong. He would learn. And then he would destroy the Harrington family, one by one, until there was nothing left but ashes and memory. The war continued. The Union armies pushed deeper into the South, and at Magnolia Fields, things were falling apart. Augustus Harrington died in January of 1865, just a few months before the war ended. His health, which had been declining for years, finally gave out. He died in his bed surrounded by servants but not by family. His sons were still fighting. His wife was long dead. And the son he had never acknowledged was working in the fields, not knowing that his father had taken his last breath. The will that Augustus had written was read by Samuel Whitfield 3 days after the funeral. Edward and Theodore Harrington, both of whom had received emergency leave to attend their father's burial, sat in the lawyer's office and listened as their inheritance was detailed. Edward received the plantation. Theodore received the railroad interests. Various sums were distributed to relatives and charities. Everything was as expected. And then Whitfield read the final clause. I wish to acknowledge my natural son, Solomon, born to the slave woman Bessie in 1849. The room went silent. Edward and Theodore looked at each other. Neither of them spoke. But their faces told the whole story. Shock, disgust, and something else. Fear. This is preposterous, Theodore finally said. Our father would never have written such a thing. He was not in his right mind. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. I assure you, Mr. Harrington, your father was of sound mind when he dictated this will. I witnessed it myself. Then you witnessed a fraud, Edward said. His voice was cold, controlled. This document is clearly a forgery. Some scheme by abolitionists to embarrass our family. Sir, I must protest. You must do nothing, Theodore interrupted. This will is invalid. The clause about the slave is especially invalid, as it violates numerous laws regarding the disposition of property. We will not honor it. Whitfield knew that arguing was pointless. He had seen that look in the Harrington brothers' eyes before. It was the look of men who were used to getting what they wanted by any means necessary. What do you wish me to do with the document? He asked. Edward and Theodore exchanged another glance. A silent communication passed between them. Destroy it, Edward said. Burn it. Pretend it never existed. And so Samuel Whitfield, lawyer, witness, and coward, did exactly that. He took the will that acknowledged Solomon as Augustus Harrington's son, the will that would have given him freedom and $50,000, and he burned it in his office fireplace. The ashes floated up the chimney and disappeared into the night sky. And Solomon, still working in the fields, never knew how close he had come to a different life. The war ended in April of 1865. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the Confederacy collapsed. Within weeks, Union soldiers arrived at Magnolia Fields and informed the slaves that they were free. Solomon was 15 years old. He had spent his entire life in bondage, never traveling more than a mile from the place where he was born. And suddenly, impossibly, he was told that he could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. The other slaves celebrated. They sang, they danced, they hugged each other and cried tears of joy. For them, this was the moment they had dreamed about for generations, the day when they would finally be treated as human beings. But Solomon did not celebrate. He stood apart from the others, watching the Union soldiers with suspicious eyes. He had learned not to trust white people. He had learned that freedom could be a trick, a trap, another way to hurt you when you least expected it. And besides, he had unfinished business. Before he left Magnolia Fields forever, Solomon went to the oak tree that Martha had told him about. He dug beneath its roots, following the directions she had given him, and found the medallion. It was tarnished from years in the earth, but the initials AH were still visible. And when he opened the back, just as Martha had described, he found the tiny key hidden inside. Solomon held the key in his palm and stared at it. This small piece of metal was somehow connected to his mother's death. It was connected to the Harringtons. It was connected to a secret that someone had killed to protect. He did not know what the key opened. He did not know how he would find out. But he made a promise to himself and to his mother's memory. He would discover the truth. He would use it to destroy the Harringtons, and he would make them suffer the way they had made his mother suffer. With the medallion around his neck and the key in his pocket, Solomon Graves walked off the Magnolia Fields plantation for the first and last time. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye. He simply walked north toward a future that he could not imagine, carrying the past with him like a weight. He was 15 years old. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back. He knew no one in the world outside the plantation, and he was going to war. A war that would last 30 years. A war that he intended to win. The years after the war were brutal for former slaves. Freedom, it turned out, was not the same as safety. It was not the same as food. It was not the same as shelter. Across the South, millions of black men, women, and children found themselves released from bondage, but abandoned to a hostile world that wanted them dead. Solomon Graves walked north with nothing but determination. He traveled at night to avoid the bands of white men who roamed the countryside, hunting freed slaves for sport. He ate whatever he could find, berries, roots, animals that he caught with his bare hands. He slept in ditches and abandoned barns, always with one eye open, always ready to run. It took him 3 weeks to reach Savannah. The city was chaos. Union soldiers patrolled the streets. Freed slaves crowded into makeshift camps, waiting for help that never came. Disease spread through the camps like wildfire. People died every day from cholera, typhoid, and simple starvation. Solomon did not stay in the camps. He had seen enough death. He wanted life. He found work at the Savannah docks, loading and unloading ships for 12 hours a day. The pay was terrible, just a few cents per day, but it was more money than he had ever seen. He saved every penny. He ate the cheapest food he could find. He slept in a corner of a warehouse, using a pile of rope as a bed. And every night, before he went to sleep, he took out the medallion and looked at the key hidden inside. He did not know what it opened. He did not know how to find out. But he knew that someday, somehow, he would discover the truth. 5 years passed. Solomon learned to read properly during those years. He found a church for black people that offered classes in the evenings. An old preacher named Reverend Thomas taught him to read the Bible, then Shakespeare, then newspapers, then legal documents. Solomon absorbed knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. He was hungry for it, desperate for it. He understood that knowledge was power, and power was what he needed to destroy the Harringtons. He also learned about business. Working at the docks, he watched how money moved. He watched how ships brought goods from one place and sold them in another. He watched how white men got rich by buying low and selling high, while black men did all the work and got nothing. By 1870, Solomon had saved enough money to make his first investment. He bought a small share in a coal shipment heading to Baltimore. The investment was risky. If the ship sank, he would lose everything. But the ship arrived safely, and Solomon's tiny investment doubled. He reinvested the profits, and doubled them again. This was the beginning of Solomon's transformation from a former slave into something that the world had never seen before. A black man with money. A black man with power. A black man who was going to use that power to burn down everything that the Harrington family had built. Solomon moved to Baltimore in 1870. He was 21 years old, and he had almost $1,000 saved, an enormous sum for a black man in those days. But he knew that $1,000 was nothing compared to what the Harringtons had. Nothing compared to what he would need to destroy them. So he kept working, kept saving, kept investing. He changed his name during his first year in Baltimore. Solomon Graves was a slave name, a name that marked him as property, a name that would follow him like a chain for the rest of his life. He needed a new name, a name that belonged to a free man, a name that commanded respect. He chose Samuel Grayson. The name had no particular meaning, he simply liked the sound of it. Samuel was a biblical name, strong and dignified. Grayson reminded him of his gray eyes, the eyes that marked him as Augustus Harrington's son. Together, the names created a new identity. A blank slate, a man with no past, and an unlimited future. Samuel Grayson began to build his empire. He started with coal, the same coal that powered the steam engines on the Harrington railroads. There was a certain irony in that, and Solomon appreciated irony. Every ton of coal that he sold was another brick in the wall he was building, another weapon in his arsenal. He bought shares in coal mines. He bought ships to transport coal. He bought warehouses to store coal. Within 5 years, he controlled a significant portion of the coal trade in the mid-Atlantic region. Within 10 years, he was one of the largest coal merchants on the East Coast. But he did not stop there. He invested in steel, in shipping, in real estate. He bought buildings in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in New York. He hired lawyers, white lawyers, who did not know that their employer was a former slave, to manage his business affairs. He created a network of companies and trusts that hid his true identity behind layers of paperwork. To the outside world, Samuel Grayson was a mysterious figure. Some said he was from Brazil. Others said he was from the Caribbean. A few whispered that he had mixed blood, that one of his parents was white. But no one knew the truth. No one suspected that Samuel Grayson had once been Solomon Graves, a slave boy from a Georgia plantation. And that was exactly how Solomon wanted it. During all those years of building his fortune, Solomon never forgot his mission. He gathered information about the Harrington family like a general gathering intelligence before a battle. He learned that Edward Harrington, the eldest brother, had died in 1878. The official story was that it was a hunting accident. Edward had been out with his brother Theodore when his gun had accidentally discharged, killing him instantly. But Solomon did not believe in accidents, not when the Harringtons were involved. He hired private investigators to dig into the case. He bribed servants and former employees. He pieced together a picture of what had really happened that day in the woods. The truth was ugly but not surprising. Edward and Theodore had been fighting for years about the direction of the family business. Edward wanted to modernize, to invest in new technologies, to treat workers better. Theodore wanted to squeeze every penny of profit out of their existing operations, no matter the cost. The brothers hated each other with a hatred that only family can produce. And then, during a hunting trip in the mountains of Virginia, Edward's gun had accidentally discharged at point-blank range, blowing half his head off. Theodore had been the only witness. Theodore had been the one to bring the body back. Theodore had been the one to arrange the funeral, inherit everything, and take control of the Harrington Empire. Solomon knew murder when he saw it. Theodore had killed his own brother to become the sole heir. And he had gotten away with it because he was rich and white and powerful. The discovery did not surprise Solomon. It did not even make him angry. It simply confirmed what he already knew. The Harringtons were monsters. They would destroy anyone who got in their way, even their own blood. Which meant that Solomon would have to be very, very careful. By 1885, Solomon was 46 years old and worth several $1 million. He had spent 2 decades building his fortune and gathering information. He knew almost everything there was to know about the Harrington family. He knew about Theodore's murder of his brother. He knew about the family's history of fraud and bribery. He knew about the dozens of workers who had died in their mines and on their railroads, their deaths covered up, their families paid off with pocket change. But he still did not know what the key opened. The tiny key from the medallion had haunted him for over 20 years. He had tried hundreds of locks, thousands of locks, any lock that might have a connection to the Harringtons. Nothing worked. The key remained a mystery, and without knowing what it opened, Solomon felt like he was missing the final piece of the puzzle. Then, in the summer of 1886, a woman came to see him. Her name was Josephine Delacroix. She was 50 years old, elegant, well-dressed, and black. She had been a slave at Magnolia Fields, working in the big house as a seamstress. She had known Bessie. She had known Solomon as a child. And she had spent the 20 years since the war building a new life for herself in Boston, running a successful dress shop that catered to wealthy white women. Josephine had tracked Solomon down through his business network. It had taken her months to penetrate the layers of secrecy that he had built around himself. But she was persistent, and she had information that she knew he would want. "I know what that key opens," she said. They were sitting in Solomon's private office in Baltimore. The door was locked. The windows were closed. Solomon had dismissed all his servants. Whatever Josephine had to say, he wanted no witnesses. "Tell me," he said. Josephine leaned forward. "There's a hidden compartment in Augustus Harrington's study, a safe built into the wall behind a painting. Nobody knows about it except the family. I only found out because I was mending curtains in the study one day and I saw Theodore opening it. He didn't know I was there." Solomon's heart was pounding. "What's inside the safe?" "A book. A black leather book. Theodore calls it the family's insurance policy. It contains records of every crime the Harringtons have ever committed. Bribes, murders, fraud, everything. Augustus started keeping it decades ago as protection against anyone who might try to betray him. If he went down, he wanted to take everyone else with him." "And the key?" Josephine smiled. "The safe has 2 locks. One is a combination lock that only Theodore knows. The other is a key lock, a very unusual key lock, with a tiny mechanism that Augustus designed himself." She pointed at Solomon's chest, where the medallion hung beneath his shirt. "That key is the only one of its kind. Augustus gave it to your mother, probably as some twisted form of love token. He never imagined she would keep it, never imagined she would pass it to her son, and he certainly never imagined that her son would come back to claim what was his." Solomon sat in silence for a long moment. Everything was falling into place. The key, the safe, the book. After more than 20 years of searching, he finally understood what his mother had known, what she had died for. The Black Book was the weapon he needed. It contained proof of everything the Harringtons had done. With that book, he could destroy them. He could expose their crimes to the world. He could make them pay for his mother's murder. But there was a problem. "The safe has 2 locks," he said. "I have the key, but I don't have the combination." Josephine nodded. "That's why I came to you. I don't know the combination either, but I know someone who might. Someone who hates Theodore Harrington almost as much as you do." "Who?" "His wife, Catherine." Catherine Harrington was the daughter of a Boston shipping magnate named William Ashford. She had married Theodore in 1875, when she was 19 years old and Theodore was 32. It was an arranged marriage, designed to merge 2 powerful families and create an even more powerful business alliance. From the outside, Catherine appeared to be the perfect wife. She hosted parties, she organized charities, she smiled and nodded and said all the right things. But behind closed doors, her life was a nightmare. Theodore was a cruel man. He had been cruel as a child, torturing animals and bullying servants. He had been cruel as a young man, using his family's money to escape the consequences of his violence. And he was cruel as a husband, treating Catherine like property rather than a partner. He controlled every aspect of her life. He told her what to wear. He told her who she could talk to. He told her when she could leave the house and when she had to stay. He hit her when she disobeyed, carefully in places where the bruises would not show. And he reminded her constantly that she was nothing without him, that her family's fortune depended on his goodwill, that if she ever tried to leave, he would destroy everyone she loved. Catherine endured 18 years of this treatment. She endured because she had no choice, because society offered no protection for abused wives, because divorce was considered worse than death for a woman of her class. But deep inside, beneath all the smiles and the parties and the perfect facade, Catherine Harrington was building a fire of her own, a fire of hatred and resentment that was waiting for the right moment to explode. Solomon was going to give her that moment. The plan came together over the following months. Josephine served as the intermediary between Solomon and Catherine. The 2 women had met years ago at a charity event and had maintained a secret friendship ever since. Catherine trusted Josephine, and when Josephine told her about Solomon, about his true identity, about his plan to destroy Theodore, Catherine was ready to help. She provided information about the mansion's layout. She provided details about Theodore's schedule. She provided the names of servants who could be bribed and guards who could be avoided. But she could not provide the combination to the safe. "Theodore has never told me," she explained in a letter that Josephine delivered to Solomon. "He keeps it locked in his memory. But I believe I know someone who might know. His mother, Edith." Edith Harrington was Augustus's second wife. He had married her in 1859 after Helena's death, more for companionship than for love. She was 81 years old now, frail and largely confined to her rooms in Rosecliff Manor. Theodore kept her around because getting rid of her would look bad. But he paid her no attention. He assumed she was senile. He assumed she knew nothing. He was wrong. Edith had been watching, listening, remembering. For decades, she had observed the crimes of her husband and stepson. She had kept silent out of fear. But now, at the end of her life, she was tired of being afraid. She wanted to see justice done before she died. And she was willing to help Solomon make it happen. Catherine arranged a meeting. Solomon arrived at Rosecliff Manor on a night in late September 1891. He came through the servants' entrance, dressed in the simple clothes of a delivery man. Catherine met him at the door and led him through back passages and hidden stairways to Edith's private rooms. The old woman was waiting for him. Edith Harrington was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair and skin like paper. but her eyes were sharp, clear, intelligent. She looked at Solomon for a long moment, studying his face, his eyes, the shape of his jaw. "You have Augustus's eyes," she finally said. "I noticed it the moment I first saw you at the charity ball last month. Those gray eyes. I spent 40 years looking at those eyes. I would know them anywhere." Solomon sat down in the chair that Catherine offered him. "You know who I am? I know exactly who you are. You're the son he never acknowledged, the child he was too cowardly to claim, the reminder of his sins that he tried to burn away." Solomon's body went rigid. "What do you know about the fire?" Edith's face twisted with old pain. "I know everything. I was there that night. Not at the cabin, but in the big house. I saw Theodore talking to Silas Crenshaw earlier that evening. I saw money change hands, and I saw Theodore watching from his window when the flames started." The world seemed to stop. Solomon had always suspected that his mother's death was murder, but he had never been able to prove it. He had never known who was responsible. Now he knew. "Theodore killed my mother." Edith nodded slowly. "He was afraid. His father had been talking about changing the will, about acknowledging you. Theodore couldn't allow that. He couldn't risk sharing the inheritance with a slave's son. So he paid Crenshaw to start the fire, to eliminate the threat." Solomon's hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. Pure, white-hot rage that he had kept buried for 30 years. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stop him?" Edith's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of what Theodore would do to me. Because I told myself that it wasn't my business, that slaves died all the time, that one more death didn't matter." She reached out and took Solomon's hand. "I was wrong. I've spent 40 years knowing I was wrong, and I want to make it right before I die." She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is the combination to the safe. I watched Augustus open it 100 times. I memorized the numbers without him knowing." Solomon took the paper with trembling fingers. "There's more," Edith continued. "Inside the safe, along with the black book, there's something else. A document that Augustus wrote before he died. A second will." "A second will?" "The first will, the one that acknowledged you, was destroyed by Samuel Whitfield after Augustus died. Theodore and Edward forced him to burn it, but Augustus didn't trust Whitfield. He made a copy himself and hid it in the safe, a copy that nobody knows about except me." Solomon could barely breathe. "Are you saying that there's legal proof that I'm Augustus Harrington's son, that I was supposed to inherit?" Edith nodded. "The will specifies that you are entitled to half of all Harrington assets. It also specifies that you must claim your inheritance by your 40th birthday, or the provision becomes void." Solomon's heart sank. "I'm 42 years old. Yes, the legal deadline has passed. You cannot claim the inheritance through the courts." Edith squeezed his hand. "But the will still proves who you are. It proves that Augustus acknowledged you as his son. And combined with the black book, it proves that Theodore killed your mother to prevent you from claiming what was rightfully yours." Solomon understood. The legal battle was lost, but the court of public opinion was still open. If he could expose the Harringtons' crimes, if he could show the world what they had done, he could destroy them just as completely as any lawsuit. Maybe more completely. "There's one more thing," Edith said. "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "My granddaughter, Lily. She's 17 years old. She's the only innocent person in this family. Theodore is planning to marry her off to a business associate, a horrible man 3 times her age. I need you to protect her. When you bring down the Harringtons, I need you to make sure that Lily escapes. Can you promise me that?" Solomon looked into the old woman's eyes and saw something he had not expected. Love. Genuine love for her granddaughter. The only pure thing left in this family of monsters. "I promise," he said. Edith smiled. It was the first real smile she had allowed herself in years. "Then go. Take the combination, find the book, and burn them all to the ground." The plan was set for the Harrington Autumn Ball, scheduled for October 2nd, 1891. It was the biggest social event of the Newport season. 500 guests, the cream of American society, newspaper reporters from every major publication. The perfect stage for Solomon's revelation. But Theodore Harrington was not a fool. He had survived this long by being paranoid, by trusting no one, by eliminating threats before they could grow. And he had noticed that something was wrong. There was a stranger in Newport, a wealthy black man named Samuel Grayson, who had appeared out of nowhere. A man who asked too many questions. A man who seemed to be everywhere the Harringtons were. Theodore hired a detective named Malcolm Vance to investigate. Vance was ex-Pinkerton, one of the best in the business. He had spent 20 years tracking down criminals, exposing secrets, destroying lives. He was expensive, and he was effective. Within 2 weeks, he had uncovered the truth. Samuel Grayson did not exist before 1870. His entire identity was a fabrication. And beneath that fabrication was a former slave from Magnolia Fields named Solomon Graves. Theodore received the report on September 28th, 4 days before the ball. He acted immediately. That night, a group of armed men broke into Solomon's rented mansion. They beat him. They dragged him to a warehouse on the Newport docks. They tied him to a chair and waited for their employer to arrive. Theodore Harrington walked into the warehouse just after midnight. He was dressed in evening clothes, having come directly from a dinner party. His eyes were cold. His smile was cruel. "So you're the bastard," he said, circling Solomon's chair. "The son of the slave my father liked to visit. I thought you died in the fire with your mother." Solomon's face was bloody. His ribs were cracked. But his voice was steady. "Sorry to disappoint you." Theodore laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Solomon. A lot of worry. All these years I thought the problem was solved. I thought Crenshaw had taken care of everything. But here you are, like a cockroach that refuses to die. You admit it then. You ordered the fire. You killed my mother." Theodore shrugged. She was a slave. She was a threat. What difference does it make now? No one will believe your word against mine. No court in this country would take the testimony of a Negro over a Harrington. He leaned close to Solomon's face. "You've lost. Whatever you were planning, whatever you thought you were going to accomplish, it's over. You're going to disappear tonight. Just like your mother should have disappeared 30 years ago." He turned to his men. "Kill him. Dump the body in the harbor. Make sure it's never found." Solomon closed his eyes. He had come so close to justice, so close to revenge. And now it was going to end in a dirty warehouse at the hands of hired thugs with no one ever knowing what had happened. He thought of his mother, of her face in the firelight, of her last words. "Avenge our blood." He had failed her. Then the shooting started. The first bullet hit the man closest to Solomon. He dropped without a sound. The second bullet hit another man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The third bullet went through the warehouse window, missing Theodore by inches. Theodore dove for cover behind a stack of crates. His remaining men scattered, pulling out their own weapons, trying to find the source of the attack. More shots, more screams, bodies falling, and then a woman's voice, clear and commanding. "Solomon, can you move?" Solomon opened his eyes. Standing in the warehouse doorway, holding a smoking revolver, was Catherine Harrington. She was wearing a simple dark dress. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Her face was pale but determined, and she was pointing her gun directly at her husband's hiding spot. "Catherine?" Theodore's voice was incredulous. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago." She fired another shot that splintered the crate near his head. "Stay down, Theodore, the next one won't miss." She ran to Solomon and cut his ropes with a knife. "Can you walk?" "I think so." His legs were shaky, but they held. "Then we need to move. More of his men are coming." They fled into the night. Behind them, Theodore was screaming for his guards. Torches were being lit. Dogs were being released. The hunt was on. Catherine led Solomon through back alleys and hidden paths that she had memorized during her years as Theodore's prisoner. She knew Newport better than anyone. She knew every shadow, every hiding place, every route that avoided the main streets. By dawn, they were safe in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. A cottage that Josephine had rented under a false name, stocked with supplies and ready for exactly this kind of emergency. Solomon collapsed onto a bed, his body screaming with pain. Catherine cleaned his wounds with water and cloth, working with the efficiency of someone who had treated injuries before. "How did you know?" Solomon asked. "How did you know where to find me?" Lily heard Theodore giving orders to his men. "She came to me immediately. She's a good girl, braver than anyone gives her credit for. Theodore will know you helped me. He'll come for you." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Let him come. I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done being his prisoner." She finished bandaging his wounds and sat back. "The ball is in 4 days. Can you still do it? Can you still expose him?" Solomon thought about the combination in his pocket. The safe, the black book, the second will. Everything he needed was still waiting for him inside Rosecliff Manor. "Yes," he said. "I can still do it, but I'll need help getting inside." Catherine nodded. "You'll have it. Lily and I will make sure every door is open." For the first time in days, Solomon allowed himself to hope. The plan was damaged, but not destroyed. Theodore thought he was dead. That gave Solomon an advantage, an opportunity for surprise. The ball was in 4 days, and Solomon intended to give Newport a night they would never forget. October 2nd, 1891. Rosecliff Manor blazed with light. Every window glowed, every chandelier sparkled. The sounds of music and laughter drifted across the manicured grounds, carried by the cool autumn breeze. 500 of America's most powerful people had gathered for the Harrington Autumn Ball. Bankers, industrialists, politicians, newspaper publishers, society matrons dripping with diamonds, young men in perfectly tailored suits. This was the elite of the Gilded Age, assembled to celebrate wealth and power and everything that money could buy. Theodore Harrington stood at the center of it all, accepting congratulations and shaking hands. He had recovered from the events of 4 nights ago. His men had found no body in the harbor, but they had also found no trace of Solomon. Theodore had convinced himself that the problem was solved, that Solomon had fled, that he was safe. He was wrong. Solomon Graves entered Rosecliff Manor through the servants' entrance at exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. He was disguised as a waiter, dressed in the same simple uniform as the dozens of other black servants who moved invisibly through the crowd. No one looked at him twice. No one asked his name. He was invisible. Just another Negro carrying a tray. He made his way through the service corridors, following the route that Catherine had mapped for him, past the kitchens, past the wine cellar, up a narrow staircase that led to the family's private rooms. The study door was unlocked, just as Catherine had promised. Solomon slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dark, lit only by moonlight streaming through tall windows. He could hear the music from the ballroom below, muffled by thick walls and heavy carpets. The painting was exactly where Josephine had described. A portrait of Augustus Harrington in his prime, hanging above the fireplace. Solomon lifted it from the wall and found the safe behind it. 2 locks, 1 combination, 1 key. His fingers trembled as he entered the numbers that Edith had given him. 3 turns to the right, 2 turns to the left, 1 turn to the right. Click. He pulled the medallion from around his neck and inserted the tiny key into the second lock. It fit perfectly. He turned it. Click. The safe swung open. Inside, Solomon found exactly what Edith had promised. The black book, bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb the moonlight. A stack of documents yellowed with age, and a single sheet of paper covered in faded handwriting that Solomon recognized from old plantation records. The second will. The proof that he was Augustus Harrington's son. Solomon took everything. He stuffed the documents into his jacket. He held the black book against his chest like a shield, and then the door opened. Malcolm Vance stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. "Mr. Grayson, or should I say, Mr. Graves." Vance smiled. "Mr. Harrington will be very interested to know that you're still alive." Solomon's mind raced. He was unarmed, trapped. His plan was falling apart for the second time in 4 days. But then something unexpected happened. A silver candlestick came down on the back of Vance's head. The detective crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Standing behind him, holding the candlestick, was a young woman with auburn hair and frightened eyes. Lily Harrington. "Miss Josephine sent me to watch the door," she whispered. "We need to go, now." Solomon followed her out of the study, through more hidden passages, down more secret stairs. The girl moved quickly and quietly, clearly terrified but determined to see this through. They emerged near the ballroom, just as Theodore was stepping onto a raised platform to address his guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Theodore's voice boomed across the crowd. "Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a historic evening. Tonight, I am pleased to announce a partnership that will reshape American industry." Solomon pushed through the crowd of servants, ignoring the confused looks, ignoring the whispered questions. He had one chance, one moment. He could not waste it. He reached the edge of the ballroom just as Theodore raised his champagne glass. "I present to you the future of American railroads, the Harrington-Morgan Alliance. Theodore Harrington." Solomon's voice cut through the applause like a knife. Every head in the room turned toward him. 500 pairs of eyes stared at the bloody, bruised black man who had suddenly appeared among them. Theodore's face went pale. "Guards, seize that man." But Solomon was already moving. He pushed past the guards, vaulted onto the platform, and stood face to face with the man who had murdered his mother. "My name is Solomon Graves," he announced to the stunned crowd, "son of Bessie Graves, son of Augustus Harrington, and I have a story to tell." The ballroom was silent, not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation, the shocked silence of people confronted with something they could not understand. Solomon opened the black book. Page 1, January 1852. Bribe paid to Judge William Mercer, Augusta County, to dismiss charges of assault against Augustus Harrington. Amount $5,000. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Page 17, March 1858. Payment to Pinkerton agents to intimidate union organizers at the Harrington Rail Yard in Baltimore. 3 workers hospitalized, 1 worker dead. The murmurs grew louder. Page 47, March 12, 1863. Solomon's voice cracked slightly. Order given to Overseer Silas Crenshaw to eliminate the slave Bessie and her son. Method, fire. Result, Bessie killed. Son escaped. Gasps, shocked faces, women covering their mouths. Theodore lunged forward. "This is lies. This man is a fraud, a criminal." But Solomon was not finished. Page 72, October 1878. Notes on the death of Edward Harrington. Method, staged hunting accident. Reason, to secure sole inheritance of family assets. The room erupted. Edward Harrington had been popular in society. Many of the guests had known him personally. The suggestion that Theodore had murdered his own brother was explosive. Theodore grabbed Solomon's jacket. "You have no proof. This book is a forgery." Is this a forgery too? An old woman's voice silenced the chaos. Everyone turned to see Edith Harrington, supported by Catherine and Lily, walking slowly toward the platform. In her hand, she held a letter. This is a confession written by my husband, Augustus Harrington, on his deathbed. It confirms everything this man has said. It acknowledges Solomon as his legitimate son, and it describes the crimes of the Harrington family in explicit detail. She handed the letter to a man in the front row. Solomon recognized him from newspaper photographs. Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World. Publish it, Edith said. Let the world know what monsters I married into. Theodore's face twisted with rage. He pulled a knife from inside his jacket and lunged at Solomon. The blade caught Solomon's arm, drawing blood. But Solomon had survived worse. He grabbed Theodore's wrist, twisted, and forced him to drop the knife. Years of physical labor had made Solomon strong. Years of hatred had made him ruthless. He could have killed Theodore. He wanted to kill Theodore. Every fiber of his being screamed for blood, for revenge, for justice. But he looked at Theodore's face, pathetic and frightened, and realized something. Killing this man would make Solomon a murderer. It would give Theodore's defenders an excuse to dismiss everything he had revealed. It would taint his victory with blood. Solomon released Theodore's wrist and stepped back. I'm not going to kill you, he said. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to let you live. I'm going to let you watch as everything you built crumbles to dust. Every friend will abandon you. Every ally will betray you. Your name will become a curse. Your legacy will be shame. He turned to the crowd of stunned, silent witnesses. That is my revenge. The aftermath was everything Solomon had hoped for, and more. Joseph Pulitzer published Edith's letter and excerpts from the Black Book on the front page of the New York World. Within days, every newspaper in America had picked up the story. The Harrington scandal, they called it. The crime of the century. Theodore was arrested and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. His trial lasted 3 months and was the most sensational legal proceeding of the decade. Witness after witness came forward to testify about the Harrington family's crimes. Servants who had kept silent for years. Business partners who had been cheated. Victims who had never dared to speak. Theodore Harrington was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died there 3 years later of a fever that swept through his cell block. The newspapers reported that no one came to claim his body. The Harrington assets were seized and liquidated. The railroad empire was sold off in pieces. The mansion in Newport was put up for auction. And Solomon Graves, using the fortune he had built over 30 years, bought it. 6 months after the ball, Solomon stood in front of Rosecliff Manor. The building had been transformed. The gaudy decorations were gone. The ostentatious displays of wealth had been removed. In their place were simple furnishings, practical equipment, and something that had never existed in this house before. Children. 50 black children, orphans and refugees from the harsh streets of northern cities, now lived in the mansion that had been built with slave labor. They slept in rooms where wealthy guests had once danced. They ate in dining halls where champagne had once flowed. They learned to read and write in libraries that had been filled with unread books. The Bessie Graves School for Negro Children opened its doors in April 1892. Solomon had hired the best teachers he could find. He had stocked the library with thousands of books. He had equipped workshops for learning trades. He had created something that the Harringtons could never have imagined. A place where the descendants of slaves could become doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders. A place where his mother's dream could finally come true. On the day the school opened, Solomon hung a bronze plaque by the front entrance. The plaque read, "In memory of Bessie Graves, 1825-1863. Slave, mother, hero. She dreamed of a world where her son would be free." This building is that dream made real. May every child who enters these doors carry her spirit forward into the future. Solomon lived for another 30 years. He saw the school grow from 50 students to 500. He saw his graduates become doctors who healed the sick, lawyers who fought for justice, teachers who educated the next generation. He saw the world begin to change slowly and painfully towards something better. He never married. He never had children of his own. The students at his school became his family. They called him Uncle Solomon, and later, Grandpa Solomon. They sat at his feet and listened to his stories about the old days, about slavery and freedom, and the long road in between. On his deathbed in 1922, surrounded by children and grandchildren of students he had taught, Solomon spoke his final words. "Mama," he whispered, "I did it. I kept my promise." He was buried next to the oak tree where Martha had hidden the medallion 73 years before. His tombstone was simple, just a name and 2 dates. But beneath the dates, at Solomon's request, was carved a single sentence. "The truth will make you free." The Bessie Graves School continued to operate until 1954, when it merged with other institutions following the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Over 6 decades, it educated more than 10,000 students. Many of them went on to become leaders in the civil rights movement. Some of them remembered the old man who had founded the school, the former slave with gray eyes who had brought down one of America's most powerful families. Solomon Graves never became famous. His name does not appear in history books. The Harrington scandal has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the wars and crises that followed. But his legacy endures. Every black doctor who heals a patient, every black lawyer who wins a case, every black teacher who inspires a student. They are all, in some way, the children of Solomon Graves, the descendants of his dream. The proof that one man's courage can change the world. The Harringtons built their empire on cruelty and greed. They believed that money and power could protect them from justice forever. They were wrong. Solomon Graves proved that the truth cannot be buried, that justice cannot be bought, that the sins of the past will always catch up with those who commit them. He proved that revenge is not about destroying your enemies. It is about building the world they tried to deny you. It is about turning your pain into purpose. It is about living so fully that their memory fades while yours becomes eternal. That is the true story of the heir of shadows, a slave who became a millionaire, a son who avenged his mother, a man who turned a mansion of oppression into a house of hope,